Welcome to episode 35 of Leading People with me, Jerry Murray. This episode is brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's widecircle.eu. Have you ever wondered what have cornflakes, penicillin, cling film, velcro, and post-it notes got in common? This week's guest is author and head of learning at the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, Andy Lancaster. During the next 45 minutes or so, he'll be answering this question, among many others. And stay tuned to the end as Andy has a special offer for you. So let's listen to what Andy has to say. Andy Lancaster, welcome to the show.
Fantastic to be here, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you. It's going to be good fun.
Great, good stuff, Andy. I've known about your work for quite some time. I've been watching you, and we have some mutual contacts in common. And we only really met a few weeks ago just to have a chat about what this would be all about today. And some of our guests may know you, and many others may not know you yet. So perhaps we just start with that question about, how did you get to where you are today? And maybe were there people or places or events that sort of stood out on your journey that helped you shape the career you have and where you've ended up today in a very prestigious professional organization?
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I start with the destination and then we can maybe work back from that. So I'm a book author, and I'm currently head of learning at the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, which is, for those who don't know, it's a professional body for HR and people development. And also I'm chair of a board for a global charity working to transform the lives of those with leprosy. So that's where I've reached. Now, I guess when I was thinking this one through, I've got a really eclectic career, and possibly if you go on LinkedIn, I might have the kind of CV which you look at and you think, how on earth has that kind of come together? So I think for me, the journey has been one of being involved in different sectors. But I think throughout it, there's been this golden thread of being really interested in people development. So I guess right from the start, my encouragement would be, in leadership, I just don't think we should be too narrow. I think there's such an opportunity to be involved in lots of different things. So that's kind of, how my career has been. And, a quick overview of that started I did a design degree. I started in teaching. Then I went and lectured at university. Then I got into technologies. Then, believe it or not, I spent some time in rehab, which always is a great one to say at parties. I spent a few years in rehab, but I was head of HR and learning for one of the big charities working with those with addictions. Then I was in housing, and then I reached CIPD. So you can see, it's a strange career. And when I look back, you couldn't have stitched this one together if you tried.
All right. So you went from rehab to housing. That was good. And then you got a job in CIPD. So that's what career progression for anybody out there who's...
There you go. But the interesting thing, around it is, I think sometimes in my early career, I thought I'd got this thing mapped out, I'd got this thing planned out, and I think there is a real sense as we develop as leaders, it's the transferable skills which are often the things which we need to recognise that they're the valuable things. We sometimes get very locked into thinking I'm in a given sector or a given role. And I think the transferable thing is really important. And I guess what troubled me, having been in education, we often narrow children down, we narrow students down, we do a degree or a master's degree if we've been fortunate to do that, and it gets narrower and narrower. And I think the transferable skills give us a very broad vista to explore, and I think that's why we've got to invest in our transferable skills.
Yeah. Of course, having had many different, let's say, types of working environments and careers, it means you bring multiple perspectives to the table, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that's a really key one, because again, that develops over time. It just made me think of a book called Medici Effect by Franz Johansson. And what was really interesting in that book, it was around how during the Renaissance, painters and sculptors and poets and scientists and philosophers and architects all kind of came together as part of this Medici dynasty. And what Johansson says is, often creativity and innovation occurs through diversity, and if you want to disrupt in a given scenario, often you need people from outside that. So I do think you're right, Jerry. I think sometimes that diversity of experience is something which is incredibly valuable, especially in our fast-changing world. So again, I'd encourage people, look for diversity, look for diverse opportunities, because those are rich in terms of our leadership.
Yeah. I was in a dinner party recently, and I think nearly every one of us around the table, all grown-up adults today, I don't think any one of us was doing something that was directly mapping from what we studied in our early life. We'd grown into other things. And talking about what you just talked about, Medici and that, in those days, go back a couple of hundred years ago, a polymath was seen as somebody brilliant, right? This concept of the generalist. And you just reminded me of a book I read about a year ago. I just can't remember the title of it now, but the guy was basically saying, actually being generalist, having a lot of diverse experiences, is becoming more useful and more valuable in the workplace. And he cites lots of research. I just can't remember the name of the book now. But anyway, listen, so I guess there were some people along the way, perhaps, and some maybe some events that also, let's say, had an influence on how whether you turned right or turned left.
Yeah, and I think people along the route are incredibly valuable. And I think we also must recognize, even though we perhaps might not perceive that at whatever stage of career we are, that we are those valuable people for others. We're part of this kind of ecosystem of generous support. And I think for me, there have been people. What's been really interesting for me, often the people who have had the most impact on me have been interested in me as a person, not interested in what I can do and what I know. And I think there's a huge distinction in that. I think sometimes in fast-paced organizations, businesses, and sectors, people are valued for the perception of what they can bring. And the people who have had the most impact on me have actually been interested in me. And I think that's really important. So some of the key mentors have seen a bigger potential in me than just what I'm doing at a given time. So yeah, I look back even to my school days. There was one particular teacher, I'll name him now, Mr. Ian Childs, his name was. He was brilliant, but he saw past just a very small lad, insignificant lad, and he was the reason that I got into teaching, because he was inspirational in terms of teaching. And he was a design teacher, so I think, Jerry, probably I ended up in design because someone saw a glimpse of something in me around design. And I go through my career, and I recognize people. Again, I'll call out a wonderful woman called Harbinder Kaur, who was my manager, my director, and my mentor during my time working in rehab. And again, she was just able to look with insight beyond just what my skill set was to what the potential was. And so I think for me, I guess what I look for is beyond just the kind of knowledge. And I suppose it comes back to Covey a little bit. You think, in the famous old 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, first you seek to understand before you are understood. And I think that generous outflow is what attracts that inward investment. So people who've shown that to me have been a role model for me, and it's something I want to do myself, and I'm hoping I'm doing that. I can be generous with my time, and as a result of that, we can just encourage people in their journey. So yeah, there have been some people along the way, and I'm forever grateful for those people, and I hope now at the stage of career I am, I can be that generous person to others.
Mm-hmm. I suppose any person out there that's in leadership or management or aspires to it, this concept of being a role model, I think it's really important that people recognize it's not just about how smart you are. Yeah, smart people get into management and leadership roles. It's often as well about the do you stand for something that people can identify with, that they can look up to? You talk about your teacher. Perhaps you were just the fact that he was a design teacher inspired you to be more interested in the topic. But I always say to people, do you ever remember at school a teacher came in after lunch and there was tomato ketchup on his shirt or her shirt, and they didn't notice it, but guess who noticed it? Everybody in the class was nudging each other and laughing. Leaders are actually, the tomato ketchup stains are visible all the time if they're not careful,
Yeah.
And so,
I've got plenty of those. There's no doubt, and to that extent, some of the stains and the scars of life are hugely important in shaping who you are. So I think you're right. It's not only people; it's events that have that shape. And we don't like going through some of the things we have to go through, but with the eye of retrospective, the retrospective view, sometimes we can see how hugely important they are in shaping who we are.
And you had an event, I think, yourself where it kind of made you stop and think. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, not something I would recommend anybody to go through, but if anybody listening in on this can learn from this one, please do. Yeah, I had a really serious health situation, which was directly related to not managing pressure properly. So this was earlier in career, and maybe at that time I thought I was invincible. I think you perhaps can. I think certainly a few years on you realise that you're not invincible. And I made a real mistake around how I was managing pressure and stress, and I basically was overcooking in a role, and I was getting migraines, so you kind of think, okay, I'm getting bad headaches with this, which I know is stress related. So I was taking tablets for that, unbeknown to me, not taking over the box dosage, but in taking painkillers, I ended up with terrible stomach ulcers and actually ended up with a life-threatening bleed. And it wasn't, Jerry, until I was actually lying in a crash room in an A&E department that I suddenly realised that I had made a serious mistake in how I was living with work pressure. And it was a shaping moment. And I think from that moment on, I've carried stressing much differently. And hopefully for my team, we are busy, but we recognise that well-being is really, really key. And again, I just look back on that one as clear as anything, lying there, realizing I was within a whisker of losing my life. I was having a blood transfusion, and it just came through very clear. I need some fresh blood, and that was a moment when I changed career and changed direction. So it was a life-changing thing. I would not want to go through it. I wouldn't recommend anybody goes through that. But that moment where you recognize that you're a mortal person, and actually work is only, and it's a fraction of what you do. But work, when it's really over pressurized, can be incredibly dangerous towards our health and well-being.
Yeah. So, and we're going to get into as we're basically evolving into the whole topic of learning, which is why you're on the program today. And but as you were describing that to me, when you're talking about the migraines, or some people call them the migraines, and you're talking about taking the pills and that, it reminds me of the concept of single loop and double loop learning. The single loop approach is, let's just take something like a pill, a remedial, and that sorts it out. Whereas a more generative, or what they call an adaptive response, as opposed to just a technical response, would be to step back and say, what's this all about? And as you quite rightly identified, this was a lifestyle thing, which was feeding this probably problem. But we see it in organizations where, and we're going to get to this maybe in a minute when we talk about how learning programs are designed, it's like throw something at it because there must be a very quick fix for that. Whereas actually sometimes we have to step back from that and think, what is the system contributing to these factors, etc. But you've written this book, right? And it's a book that's received a book award. Actually, that might be what attracted my attention. I think I saw a wonderful picture of you getting this award on LinkedIn or something. And for our listeners, remind us what the title is again.
So the title is Driving Performance Through Learning. And I think at the heart of that title, Jerry, is the fact that true learning will have a marked change in how we do things or how we perform. Learning must lead to an impact or an outcome, be that a personal one or an organizational one. So I guess what inspired me to write the thing, I was speaking at a lot of conferences and people were just sort of saying, can I have your PowerPoint presentation? And I was giving those away. But I was going through my own kind of transition process in my own thinking as a learning professional, but also as head of learning at CIPD, about how learning is changing now and how the concept of just having a formal course or a program is not cutting it. What we've got to do now is move learning far closer to the workplace, far closer to the moment of need. So that was the reason for writing the book. So really, I guess it's an exploration of how we can move learning more towards the moment of need, more in the flow of work, and really how we move away from this addiction to courses. Ironically, having worked in addiction services, it's quite, I guess, a provocative thing to say, but most organizations, I believe, are addicted to running courses and programs. You know, senior leaders just want you to run a course. And those of us who have been around this know that whilst there's inherently nothing wrong with designing a program, it isn't going to fix everything. So, yeah, the book was written with that in mind. And yeah, I was as surprised as anybody that it got an award in the Business Book Awards. But I think it was of its moment where many people are realizing now that we've got to transition organizational learning. And I think it just hit that moment where a lot of people are thinking, how do we do this differently? And obviously the book goes into some detail about ways of supporting learning beyond just formal courses.
And what did this all happen pre-COVID, during COVID? How did this evolve? Was it something that was kind of percolating for a while, and COVID also contributed to your thinking, or?
Yeah, I think that was right. It was written before COVID. Anybody who's in organizational learning has been watching this trend happening, and it's been fueled by an increase in digital, an increase in learning communities, professional communities. You know, the amount of resources which are now available means that curating great content is part of the mix, coaching in the moment. So I think we'd seen it coming. What's been really interesting, and this has been backed up by CIPD's research, obviously as an institute we have research projects going on as well. COVID has simply accelerated the process. So whereas at one time you may have some people who were slightly skeptical about the concept of maybe digital learning or online communities, COVID just thrust us into a situation where most organizations had to move towards that. So I think it's dispelled some of the doubts that this is actually going to be beneficial. And what's really interesting is our own research has shown that as we emerge from COVID, we're not through. Although obviously when we do a podcast, Jerry, in years to come, people might be thinking if this does last for years to come. We're on the way through a pandemic here. I think most people have realised it's changed for good. And I think there's not much good has come out of a pandemic. But in terms of learning, the validation of great digital in the moment, coached, supported learning, I think that's now been seen with huge value in organisations.
Yeah, and it's a great example of something which, when it hit, I mean, personally, I'd been interested in the whole digital thing way back in 2015, and I acquired tools, to start creating this flipped classroom blended approach to learning. And that's only looking at the way what we call training is done, because learning is beyond that. I was often like an echo chamber, talking to myself, and people were saying, yeah, it sounds really good. And very few people were doing anything with it. And then what happened to the profession was within a week, many of my friends and professional colleagues just said to me, my diary, my agenda, my calendar is wiped. Everything got cancelled. And a lot of people were going, maybe this is the end. And then all of a sudden, there was an amazing amount of creativity and innovation took place. People learned these tools really quickly that they'd probably been avoiding, whether it was Zoom or Teams or whatever. And all of a sudden, we had a whole new renaissance in what could happen and what could be done. I just fear a little bit because I don't want to compromise any people out there that know me and stuff. I just fear that there could be some pendulum swinging back again in some contexts, because more and more people are returning to what we call the classroom. Trainers like to say back in the classroom. And I'm disappointed sometimes that I don't see the digital back include. It's almost like we had to go through that, but that's over now. Let's go back to the way we used to do it. So I'm hoping that some of the stuff I'm seeing is just a blip, and that people are starting to look at this in a broader way. But I think we really want to get into this concept of learning rather than just training, because it's a bigger concept and it involves a lot more stuff. And I think we really wanted to get in this conversation here the angle for leaders. So if there's people out there in leadership roles or management roles, or anybody, as I always say, younger people who one day want to move into those roles, tell us where they should, if they buy this book, and I hope they will, where they should sort of focus. What are they going to get out of this book? There's some chapters in there, I believe, that are going to be really relevant for them to really absorb the content and think about it, what it means to them. In the next part of our conversation, we explore topics such as social learning, leadership denial, taking risks, and even why high-performing teams make more mistakes. Andy also advocates for making mistakes a key part of leadership development. So, back to Andy.
Yep. So the book is designed in sections. So at the beginning, it looks at the changing world of work, workforce, and workplace. So we've got to understand the context first of all for how learning. So there's an organisational context for this, and there's some underpinning theories in terms of those who are designing learning. So if there's folks listening to this podcast who are involved with designing learning, there's things about how we track impact, how we now use data and analytics to really help us diagnose what's going on. But then I just covered a whole range of things, which creative ways of learning beyond just going on a course. And I think to your point, it's important to say we're not going to lose face-to-face learning. There are certain things that face-to-face are absolutely wonderful for, particularly things like behavioral or where we've got those emotional connections going on. But a lot of knowledge transfer and a lot of learning can be done in much more creative ways. So there's things like how do we leverage digital? I'm sitting here with a mobile phone, a smartphone, smart device here. The reality is, Jerry, most of us, our lives are now powered by smart devices. Even my parents in their late 80s using smart devices now. So we've got to recognize that accessing stuff in a really convenient way is really important for us. We can't say to people, you've got to wait 3 weeks or 2 months to go on a course. That immediacy is really important. But then there's things like, as I said, coaching in the moment. This whole thing about learning communities. We've already mentioned the Medici. There's this whole thing about being connected with other people is a key way in which we learn. We learn as a small child. That's how that social learning is how that takes place. And we now can replicate that. So that there's a whole thing around curating content. So I guess what we've got are a number of ways in which creatively we can learn. And I think one of them I just mentioned to you when obviously we were talking prior to setting up the session was I think mistakes are hugely important in leadership development. And yet it's an area which it's really taboo in organizations. You don't want to make mistakes, where in fact anybody who's progressed in leadership will probably recognize that mistakes are some of their richest learning experiences. So we've got to understand how do we, for instance, leverage mistakes in our leadership learning.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my previous guests talked about this idea of leaders being prepared to be vulnerable, and often that means being prepared to acknowledge that they make mistakes, right? But tell us more about this, because I'm personally fascinated by it, because I used to teach music and I've been a professional musician all my life. And you to get good at it, you make tons of mistakes over and over and over again. You just keep making mistakes. But what you do is you try and reduce them. Taking your whole communities of practice. I come from the Irish traditional music world. The most useful thing we can do is get into a bar in the corner and jam together. And we just say, oh, there's a tune. Oh, there's a little thing you did there. Could you teach me that when there's a little bit of a break? And so, you get a foundation from something formal, and then, most learning is taking place in more informal ways, etc. But let's really unpack this, because the challenge with mistakes is if an organization hasn't got what Amy Edmondson calls this psychological safety, or a perception that it's okay sometimes to do this, then people might be saying out there, it's okay for those two blokes saying, make mistakes, but you want to come work where I work and you get crucified for it. So tell people now how they can go about embracing this concept and actually developing it as acceptable.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely. I love your analogy about learning an instrument. My goodness, I learned the French horn when I was at school, and my parents must have been through hell when I was practicing this thing because it was painful, and yet we don't sometimes value. Yeah, if you, I was never any virtuoso on this, but there without doubt that learning process has got that is it's mistakes and learning are embedded in that. So I think from my point of view, it's really interesting. If you look at organizations that are either innovative, really on the edge of stuff, or organizations where improvement is really at the heart of what they're doing, they have dealt with this issue of mistakes. Now, quite clearly, perhaps in a moment we can set this in the context of risk, because I think that's probably what you're intimating. Unless we can balance this against risk, then we've got real problems going on. But no, mistakes are really important. But we learn from a young age as kids that we cover up our mistakes. It's the typical little child with chocolate all around their mouth, and the parents says, have you been eating the chocolates? And the kid from an early age says no, and the evidence is all there. And this is what it's like in organizations. We walk around with chocolate on our faces, everybody can see what's gone on, but there's this denial, or we distort it. We don't try to make sure it doesn't look as bad as it is, or we disassociate. So I think the reality is this happens. What I guess my proposition is that great leaders build, to your point, psychological safety, where you can harness and benefit from mistakes. And it was interesting, in doing the research of the book, there's a great book called Why Smart Executives Fail. And it analysed failures in 50 organisations. And what was really interesting, a book by Finkelstein, what was really interesting is that the higher people are up in the management hierarchy, the more they tend to enhance their perfectionism with excuses. So in other words, if at the highest levels of organisation we're not embracing a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, it's very difficult for other people to kind of to do that. And I guess a classic from that was the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, where the senior management team at NASA just did not accept that a mistake had been made. However, when it was found that a piece of insulating foam had broken off and it had caused the disaster, then there was the ability to move on. But leadership denial was at the heart of a tragedy. So, we can unpack in a second around this, but I think you're absolutely right, psychological safety. But I think for everybody who's in a leadership position, a management position, we can build a culture in our teams where mistakes are not catastrophic, where they can be a brilliant vehicle for learning.
Yeah. And we're not talking here about open season, like mistakes everywhere all the time, because you have to create tools and other things that the mistakes don't just go mad. But it's being able to sort of say that in context, it's okay if you don't get it right first time, maybe the second time. What's probably underpinning that is an ability to learn from a mistake and continuous improvement. Would I be kind of touching on something there?
Yeah, and I think I'm really in a moment want to just touch on risk, because what we're not saying is make catastrophic mistakes, which in the case of the Columbia disaster, a catastrophic mistake, which obviously led to the loss of life. And you just can't imagine what those families went through as a result of obviously that mistake which was happening. But most mistakes are not like that. I think many people who are listening to the podcast series, Joe, would probably be aware of Matthew Syed's brilliant book on black box thinking, where there's a comparison between the aircraft industry and the medical industry. Now, obviously, we can't just generalize around that, but in general, within the aircraft industry, where there is a mistake, the black box, everybody shares the data, everybody shares the information, the learning, so that we can all benefit from that. Where obviously the medical profession, what Syed proposes is that often there's a cover-up for mistakes. So I think there is, there's some great writing around that where you can have this openness, psychological safety. People realize that actually being able to admit a mistake, won't lead to you being, necessarily on some huge performance plan, or you're stuck, right at the bottom of a talent system. Actually, that mistakes are something we all do, and we can learn through those. So I think if somebody is just trying to grapple with this, I would recommend Matthew Syed's book, because I think it really does begin to set the context about organizational openness as a means for development and improvement.
And if I'm not mistaken, Amy Edmondson's original work that led to her sort of developing her concept or theories around psychological safety came from doing some research in the medical domain, where she found that once she found what you just highlighted, but when she discovered teams that were more open about mistakes, actually the patient's risk of dying diminished. There was more success rate in the operating room as a result of people being more open, because what you're probably saying is when you're open to sharing. But what was happening there was a culture where the consultant was always right, and sometimes the more junior people saw what could go wrong but didn't speak up. So
the thing I love about Edmondson's work, and this is so counterintuitive, but it just highlights what we're talking about, that well-led teams appear to make more mistakes than average teams. So the teams that were doing really well were making more mistakes, which is that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, you'd think the high-performing teams are making more mistakes than the teams who are not. But what obviously is going on is that the high-performing teams were able to disclose those mistakes and benefit from them. The less high-performing teams didn't want to disclose that stuff. So it's a real puzzle. So it's the kind of classic thing, there's no mistakes in our organization. Well, that probably ain't a high-performing organization. The ones that are doing really well, you know about the mistakes and you're sharing and working around those. So I think it's a really good point to Amy Edmondson's work, that teams that make mistakes and are able to declare and learn from those are going to be far more innovative and far more high performing.
Yeah, because what you're going to find is if they don't disclose mistakes, they'll keep making those same mistakes again, whereas the teams that disclose them fix those and they make new mistakes which help them improve. So at the end of the day, you can see how it's more generative to do that. But what I'd like to get to is how can we leverage mistakes in leadership? And you actually have said that, even maybe as a precursor to that you have some examples of why actual mistakes can be brilliant. They can actually even turn an organization into massive success and profitability, because some of the most famous products and stuff we know were mistakes. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic. It's a great one to, so if you're listening to the podcast and you've not heard some of these ones, it's a great icebreaker. So what have cornflakes, penicillin, cling film, velcro, and post-it notes all got in common? Well, it's a simple thing. They all were a result of a mistake. So some of these brilliant products which we have now were direct result of mistakes which were leveraged for positive kind of things. So cornflakes came from some overcooked boiled wheat which had been left on the side and went a bit crispy, and William Kellogg found out it was quite tasty. Again, penicillin, Alexander Fleming went on holiday, left the Petri dish out, and then found that the penicillin had developed and had kind of stopped the growth of the kind of disease. You've got the one I hadn't sussed before. I mean, a couple of ones I thought were really great. The cling film one was a chemist called Jacques Brandenburger, who accidentally spilt some wine on a tablecloth and was trying to create a waterproof coated fabric, but every time he tried to do it, the waterproof thing peeled off, and as a result of that, he invented cellophane, which is just crazy. And again, just the other one. I mean, Velcro, Swiss engineer, dog ran into a bush, got covered in burrs. It was very difficult to get these things out of the dog's fur, and as a result of Velcro was made. So there's just a few of those. You can go and find many examples of this where someone just had the foresight to recognize that what seemed to be a mistake or a disaster could actually be turned into performance and innovation. And I guess that's the heart, Jerry, of what we're saying here. We look in your context, in the where you're working, and some of those mistakes might be the keys to real progression within what you're doing.
Yeah. And if you go to the work of Edward de Bono, for example, he would say that all great inventions and creativity make perfect sense and are very logical in hindsight when you work back. But you'd never get to that result by following a logical straight path. So, yeah.
Well, it's like go and throw your dog in a hedge and you can invent velcro. I mean, it just doesn't work like that, does it? But yeah, that's where the savvy leader is able to look with a different eye around a seeming mistake to see what can be leveraged from it.
Okay, so I think you've got at least 5, if not 7, ways in which leaders could leverage mistakes for the better in their organizations. So whether somebody out there is leading, whether somebody's a consultant advisor, or whether somebody wants to be in these leadership roles eventually, let's go for it. In the final few minutes, Andy outlines how leaders could leverage mistakes in a positive way, what we can learn from the Japanese art of kintsugi, and, of course, there's his special offer to look forward to.
Yeah, I'll do them really quick because, again, the headings will give you a framework to hang your own thinking around. So first one, we need to destigmatize and celebrate failures. Yes, celebrate failures. And there's some great examples of organizations which go out of their way when, to actually allow people to admit when things have gone wrong. So I think we've got to change the culture. The second one I think is really important is about reflective practice. There's no doubt that powerful learning is underpinned by reflection. So we need to make room for staff to reflect, to be able to understand what went well, what might have gone wrong. So I think reflective practice is a key one for us. There's a term which people will know, fail fast, learn quick. So the third one is, don't be worried if it goes wrong, but learn from it quickly. Simulations and experimentation, again, if you want to be in innovation, there's room now within organizations to have simulations where people can learn. There's great customer service, virtual reality scenarios now where you can try things out and see how it works. So I think that's another one. Lessons learned reviews, where we actually look back on things, and linked to that, I've suggested a thing called mistake learning sets, rather like action learning sets, where we gather together and share our mistakes. And lastly, I think, and it's an important one, we've got to look at sensible risk taking. So we're not looking at tragic mistakes, which are high cost, low benefit. What we're looking is brilliant mistakes, which are low cost and high benefit. That comes from a guy called Paul Showmaker in Brilliant Mistakes. So we're looking for brilliant mistakes which have low cost, high benefit rather than tragic mistakes. So yeah, there's just 7 things there. But I think what's interesting on all of those, I think there's a cultural shift, Jerry, around many of those. It's a cultural thing that we've got to change within the teams and organizations we work.
Okay, yeah. I know we have got quite a few people listening to this podcast who work in training capacity in that. Just unpack number 6 for me, the mistake learning sets. You mentioned action learning sets. How does let's say a little session with mistake learning sets, how does that work?
Yeah, so for me, I suppose it's, action learning sets have been around and they're brilliant. The Reg Revens thing. I mean, often what you're bringing when I've run action learning sets is you're bringing a scenario and you're unpacking it in a peer context as to how you could do it. I think mistake learning sets for me, I guess it's almost a bit like the kind of the lessons reviewed thing. We bring a mistake to the gang and we say, what could we have done differently? Because sometimes I think the reason I've made a mistake in a given situation, I've got a blind spot or it's a lack of knowledge or whatever. So I think by bringing your mistake and allowing peers to work with you to say, what could we have done differently, in retrospect, because as you rightly said, hindsight often is brilliant in terms of these. So I think it's great to be in a peer setting where you can almost have without condemnation, you can have a deconstruct of what went wrong, and you allow people to give you ideas. So yeah, that's kind of my mistake learning set, and I think sometimes we move on too quickly from error. We don't extract the maximum benefit from a situation. So I think that kind of review with peers is really valuable. And again, you may save someone else from making the same mistake. So that was the kind of concept around in a learning set. Let's talk about mistakes and look at options. Okay.
There's just one little thing that keeps jumping into my head. So it must be an important fact. Otherwise, it wouldn't keep knocking on the side of my skull. And this is this notion of blame. And yep. I suppose the question is, before I ask you the question, it never ceases to amaze me. I watch journalists interview people when something goes wrong. And one of the common questions is, who's to blame? Now, anybody who's done any systems thinking will know that it may not be one actor. It could be, and it may not be one action. It could be a series of things that just came together, which created an issue. It compounded itself, right? But we have this obsession. If the journalists are doing it, we're listening to it all the time when we watch the news, right? We're probably getting a bit of that at school. So how does an organization or a leader go about, let's say, dampening it down, or at least making an attempt to say, we've got to stop blaming people because it doesn't help? How have you seen that being done, or how do organizations and leaders go about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think blame, sometimes we place people in almost impossible circumstances. And then when there's a mistake or failure, in a sense, they've almost been set up. And I think then there's a quick culture to say who's at fault here. I mean, the reality is that in many situations, mistakes occur for simple things like there was a lack of clarity or insufficient time and resources. There wasn't a risk analysis. There was pressure in the system from peers or customers. Sometimes there was a problem of bias going on, or there could just simply be the lack of courage to do the right thing. So I think part of it is not to blame, but to step back as leaders and actually have a look at the ecosystem in which this thing happened, and be very clear that it may not be blaming someone, it may be a systemic issue. And I think that's real leadership, where you step back and say, in that given situation, Andy got it wrong, but you know what, there were circumstances whereby when we look back at it, we can recognize that the very conditions were not helpful in that. But again, we like to I think sometimes, Jerry, it's because we want to pin it on a person, but not pin it on as a process or a system or an organization. No. And it takes more effort to actually look at a process than it does to just blame a person. And I think that's what we've got to do. So I think if something has gone wrong, stand back, reflect, and recognize what the contributing factors. In my experience, it's never one. There's normally a whole range of things going on there. But that's responsible leadership, which coaches someone to say, this is why there was a problem.
Yeah, and often it's the why question that actually is probably not the first question that should be asked. It's like, what happened and how did this happen? Because the only way to answer a how question properly is you got to run the process. Like, you got to have an actor with a verb and something being acted on. And often when you ask how did this happen, people start to realize maybe it wasn't just one person. Maybe it was, he thought he had to do X. When he did that, somebody else interacted with that. We ended up with a process or a system, as you say, which seemed to veer off course, produced an outcome that nobody had expected or wanted. And we don't get very far by going back trying to find which was that one person. Who can we pin this on? Because that doesn't help, because everybody's wary of it, because they go, when something happens here, they're going to go on a manhunt to find that one person. And what do people do then? They cover their, whatever they call their proverbials, and they do their best to. And then what happens? You go back to your concept of risk. Nobody wants to take a risk lest they get blamed. Okay, coming to the end. You shared with me a beautiful concept called kintsugi, and I think I pronounced it correctly. Yep. So kintsugi. Okay. Now, I bet you our guests are wondering, what am I talking about here? Have I had too much sake? Right. Okay. So let's explain to our listeners here as a final part what kintsugi is and how you've found that so useful in this work you've done around the whole thing of mistakes, but also how it relates to driving performance through learning.
Yeah. This was just a moment where sometimes you have those serendipitous things where you see something and it just falls into place. So I've been researching and gathering stuff about mistakes in organizations, those kind of things. And then I came across this kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of what they call golden repair. So what happens if you accidentally drop a bowl or something and it smashes into pieces? In our disposable culture, maybe here's one, in our organizational disposable culture, what we do is we bin someone or we bin a given process. But what this Japanese art does is it mends the broken thing with lacquer or glue, which has got either powdered gold, silver, or platinum in. So you have this broken thing which is repaired with valuable veins running through it, where you can see where it was shattered, where it was broken. And in the concept of this one is those broken lines are part of the history of that object. It doesn't mean the object is not valuable, but it's something which is to be celebrated rather than discarded or hidden. And there's some great pictures, and if you just go online and just Google it, you'll find some wonderful artifacts which have been mended in this way. And I guess in kind of rounding this up for me, Jerry, we go back to my health scare. That is gold for me now. It's been something that's changed my approach. And many of the mistakes, and for those of you listening in, I'm sure there's things you recognize in your own situation. Some of those things are glorious in terms of how they've shaped us in leadership. So I just take that analogy there. You don't throw it away. What you do is you repair it, but you repair it with something valuable, which highlights how that the history, the wonderful history of this flawed object, but it's still really useful, even though it's been broken. So I just think it's a great analogy.
Yeah, so the object actually has a renaissance, an evolution, and a new sense of beauty because it's been repaired, basically, I guess, is that's
leadership, isn't it? Anybody who's been a brilliant leader has had brokenness there. There's no doubt in my mind. We might cover it up, we might not want to show it at conferences, but there is always brokenness in leadership. And I think those who are wonderful role models for others just allow people to see some of that brokenness, and that's where great mentors just allow you to see a little bit of where they've been through, and then we all begin to share, and we see these rich veins of learning, rich veins of improvement, which have come through brokenness.
Well, Andy, on that wonderful note, I'd like to thank you for all your insights and sharing your own learning and wisdom with us today. I hope our listeners got as much out of it as I did.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks for the opportunity. And let's just keep learning. Hey.
Oh, yeah. And how do people get in contact with you? Because that's important.
Yeah, probably the best way through LinkedIn. You'll find me on LinkedIn. So it's Andy Lancaster. And if you go on my LinkedIn profile, if you want to message me on there, I get a discount 20% for my books, Jerry. So if you are interested, it's not a big sell, but if you do want to get the book, I'll gladly give you my discounts. If you send me a direct message on LinkedIn, let's connect on LinkedIn, because it's great to be in these communities of practice. So just make sure when you connect, you can just say you listen to the podcast, and if you message me, I'll gladly give you a discount for my book, Driving Performance Through Learning.
Right, so there you are, folks. Anybody who wants a discount on Andy's excellent book, Driving Performance Through Learning, just message him on LinkedIn, mention the podcast, and he'll take it from there. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode. You will find details of what we covered in the show with links, etc. in the show notes. Please share your key takeaways from today's guest and let your friends and colleagues know about the podcast. Oh, and if there's a particular author or leading thinker you'd like me to interview, just get in touch and I'll do my best to get them on the show. This episode was brought to you by Wide Circle, helping you make better talent decisions. To learn more, visit widecircle.eu. That's WIDECIRCLE.eu. Until next time.